The fearless empire meets the fearless species. The Vorthak had ruled the galaxy for 50,000 years, and in all that time they had never encountered a species that could resist their gift. Fear was their weapon, terror their currency, and panic their path to absolute dominion. When the great ships of the Vorthak Empire descended upon a world, civilizations didn't fight back. They trembled, they wept, they surrendered, and then they served. Commander Zix Thala stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Nightmare's Edge, her 6 arms working across the control matrices with practiced precision. Her species had evolved beyond the need for individual names in most contexts, but the conquered races needed something to call their masters. The neural crown upon her elongated skull pulsed with a deep purple light, ready to broadcast the psychic waves that would reduce any planetary population to cowering masses within hours. Long-range scanners detect the target system, reported her tactical officer, Sub-Commander Krelvosh. Third planet shows signs of a Type 1 civilization. Standard population estimates suggest approximately 8 billion sentient beings. Zix Thala's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. 8 billion minds to break. 8 billion souls to bend to the Empire's will. Initiate standard first contact protocols. Begin with low-intensity fear broadcasts. I want them softened before we announce our presence. The Nightmare's Edge and its escort fleet positioned themselves at the edge of the solar system, just beyond the orbit of the outermost planet. Massive psychic amplifiers extended from the ships like metal flowers blooming in the void. The Vorthak had perfected this art over millennia. They would flood the target world with waves of primal terror, inducing nightmares, paranoia, and overwhelming dread in every sentient being on the planet. By the time the ships revealed themselves, the population would be so psychologically shattered that conquest became a mere formality. Dr. Sarah Chen was working late in her laboratory at the Tokyo Institute of Neuroscience when the dreams began. At first, she dismissed the sudden wave of anxiety that washed over her as simple exhaustion. She had been studying unusual brainwave patterns detected by deep space monitoring stations for weeks, patterns that seemed almost artificially generated, but then the nightmares started worldwide. Within 72 hours, every major news network was reporting the same phenomenon. People across the globe were experiencing identical terror dreams. Children woke screaming about shadowy figures with too many arms. Adults found themselves paralyzed by inexplicable dread during daylight hours. Mental health facilities were overwhelmed with patients reporting the same symptoms: crushing fear, inability to concentrate, and the persistent feeling of being watched by something vast and malevolent. Sarah's research team worked around the clock, analyzing the neural data. What they discovered defied conventional understanding of human psychology. The fear patterns weren't originating from within human brains, they were being induced by an external source. Something was broadcasting terror directly into the minds of everyone on Earth. Dr. Chen, her assistant called from across the lab, voice trembling with barely controlled panic. You need to see this. The deep space arrays are picking up artificial signals. They're synchronized with the fear episodes. Captain Marcus Rivera had seen combat in 3 different theaters of war, but nothing had prepared him for the call that came at 300 hours on a Tuesday that would forever mark the beginning of humanity's strangest war. Captain, we have a situation. The voice on the secure line belonged to General Patricia Hawk, head of the newly formed Joint Space Defense Initiative. Those nightmares everyone's been having? They're not natural. We've got visitors and they're not friendly. Within hours, Marcus found himself in a briefing room beneath the Pentagon, staring at images that made his blood run cold. The satellites had finally captured them, massive, organic-looking ships lurking at the edge of the solar system. The vessels were unlike anything in human aerospace design, appearing more grown than built, with surfaces that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own internal light. Intelligence estimates suggest this is a first contact scenario. General, Hawk continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. But instead of radio signals or peaceful overtures, they're attacking us psychologically. Every man, woman, and child on Earth is being subjected to artificially induced terror. Marcus studied the data streams flowing across the screens. The Tao, fear broadcasts were becoming stronger, more targeted. Some people were beginning to exhibit signs of complete psychological breakdown, while others seemed to be developing an almost manic intensity in response to the terror. "What's our response? Protocol for something like this?" Marcus asked. General Hawk's expression was grim. "We're writing it as we go, Captain. But I'll tell you one thing we're not doing. We're not surrendering to anyone who thinks they can break the human spirit with bad dreams." Aboard the Nightmare's Edge, Commander Zixthala was experiencing something unprecedented in her long military career: confusion. The fear broadcasts should have reduced the target population to a state of complete psychological submission within the first week. Instead, the readings from the planet's surface were becoming increasingly chaotic. "Sub-Commander, report on. Target population status," she commanded. Krelvosh's neural crown flickered with uncertainty. "Commander, the results are anomalous. The fear broadcasts are definitely affecting the target species, but instead of submission behaviors, we're detecting increased military communications, industrial activity, and what appears to be aggressive response preparation." This was impossible. In 50,000 years of conquest, no species had ever responded to Vorthak fear projection with anything other than paralysis and surrender. The psychological attacks were designed to target the most fundamental survival instincts of sentient beings, reducing them to primitive, cowering creatures incapable of organized resistance. "Increase broadcast intensity by 30%, Zixthala ordered. "Perhaps their neural architecture requires stronger stimulus." The psychic amplifiers aboard the Vorthak fleet began to pulse with greater intensity. Waves of concentrated terror washed over Earth like invisible tsunamis of dread. The nightmares became more vivid, the daytime anxiety more crushing, and the sense of impending doom more overwhelming. But something extraordinary was happening to humanity. Instead of breaking under the psychological assault, people began to adapt. Support groups formed spontaneously across the globe as individuals realized they weren't alone in their terror. Scientists like Dr. Chen worked frantically to understand and counter the alien influence. Military personnel like Captain Rivera organized resistance efforts that turned fear into focus and terror into determination. In small towns and major cities, a strange phenomenon emerged. The artificial fear was so intense, so obviously external, that many humans began to recognize it as an attack rather than a natural emotional response. And humans, throughout their violent and tumultuous history, had always possessed one particular trait that set them apart from other species. When attacked, they fought back. Elder Mordegath had lived for over 3,000 standard cycles, long enough to witness the conquest of hundreds of worlds. From his position in the council chambers aboard the massive command ship Eternal Dominion, he monitored the progress of what should have been a routine subjugation. But the reports from Commander Zixthala were deeply troubling. Not only were the humans failing to submit to fear projection, but their response patterns suggested they were actually using the terror as a form of psychological fuel. Military installations that should have been paralyzed with dread were instead showing increased activity. Scientific facilities were working around the clock. Most disturbing of all, the humans were beginning to broadcast their own signals. "Elder?" The communication from the advance fleet crackled with static and something else, something that sounded almost like excitement. "The target species has made contact. They're trying to communicate." The message that reached the Vorthak fleet was transmitted on every frequency simultaneously, in every major human language, accompanied by mathematical proofs and universal constants to demonstrate intelligence and intentionality. To the beings causing the fear broadcasts, "We know you're out there, we know what you're doing, and we know you expect us to surrender. Here's what we want you to know about humanity. We've been afraid before. We've been terrified, traumatized, and pushed to the edge of extinction more times than we can count. But we're still here, and every time something tried to break us with fear, we learned to turn that fear into something else, something stronger. You want to play psychological games? Let's play." Commander Zixthala stared at the translation matrix, her 6 arms frozen in disbelief. No conquered species had ever responded to Vorthak domination attempts with what could only be described as a challenge. And then, the impossible happened. The humans began broadcasting back. Dr. Sarah Chen's team had spent weeks analyzing the alien fear signals, reverse engineering their psychic broadcast technology using quantum resonance principles that pushed human science into entirely new territories. Working with military strategists and psychological warfare experts, they developed humanity's first psychic defense and counterattack system. If the aliens wanted to play with fear, they were about to learn that humans had invented some of the most sophisticated terror in the galaxy. They were about to discover what it meant to face a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and global catastrophes, not by conquering their fear, but by transforming it into resolve. The first human psychic broadcast reached the Vorthak fleet at exactly 13:47 hours, Earth Standard Time. It wasn't a message of surrender or plea for mercy. It was a carefully crafted psychological payload designed to do something the Vorthak had never experienced in their species' history. It made them afraid. For the first time in 50,000 years, the hunters were about to become the hunted. And humanity was just getting started. When fear becomes fuel, the first human psychic counterattack hit the Vorthak fleet like a wave of liquid nightmare. But it wasn't the primal instinctual terror that the aliens had been broadcasting to Earth. This was something far more sophisticated, far more human in its cruelty. It was the fear of irrelevance. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked with a team of psychologists, historians, and military strategists to craft the perfect psychological weapon. Instead of generic terror, they broadcast specific, targeted fears that struck at the core of Vorthak psychology. The fear of being forgotten, the fear that their great empire was meaningless, the fear that somewhere in the vast universe, they were just another species that would eventually fade into cosmic dust, leaving no trace of their existence. Commander Zixthala felt it first as a small doubt, a tiny crack in the certainty that had guided her species for millennia. Then the doubt grew, spreading through her neural pathways like ice water in her veins. For the first time in her existence, she questioned whether the Vorthak Empire was as eternal as she had always believed. "Commander," Subcommander Krelvosh's voice trembled with an emotion that had no name in the Vorthak language. "The crew, they are experiencing something unprecedented. Some have disconnected from the neural network entirely. Others are requesting immediate evacuation from this system." Across the fleet, Vorthak soldiers who had conquered 1,000 worlds found themselves paralyzed not by any physical weapon, but by the sudden, overwhelming realization that they might not be the apex predators they had always believed themselves to be. The humans had done something impossible. They had turned the Vorthak's greatest strength into a weakness by forcing them to confront the one fear they had never learned to weaponize: the fear of themselves. Captain Marcus Rivera watched the tactical displays from the command center of the newly constructed orbital defense platform Defiance. The alien ships had remained stationary for 72 hours since the first human counter-broadcast, their previously coordinated movements now erratic and confused. "Dr. Chen, report on the effectiveness of our psychological warfare protocols," Marcus requested through the comm system. Sarah's voice came through clearly, though Marcus could hear the exhaustion of weeks of non-stop work behind her words. "Captain, the neural feedback we're receiving suggests we've achieved something unprecedented. The aliens appear to be experiencing genuine psychological distress for the first time in their species' recorded history. However, we need to be prepared for escalation. They're adapting to our counterattacks faster than we initially projected." She was right. Even as humanity celebrated the first successful defense against the alien psychological assault, new readings were coming in from the edge of the solar system. More ships were arriving, dozens, then hundreds of massive vessels that dwarfed even the original fleet. The Vorthak Empire was mobilizing in force, but humanity was adapting too. In underground facilities across the globe, a new type of technology was being developed. Scientists had discovered that the alien fear broadcasts weren't just psychological weapons, they were also a form of energy that could be harvested, concentrated, and redirected. Fear, it turned out, was one of the most potent forces in the universe when properly channeled. Captain Rivera found himself standing in a laboratory that looked more like a cathedral than a research facility. Massive crystalline structures rose from the floor, pulsing with captured alien energy. Dr. Chen stood before a bank of monitors that showed the psychic energy being converted into usable power. "We call it terror dynamic energy," she explained, her eyes bright with the kind of manic intensity that had driven human innovation for millennia. "The aliens have been broadcasting fear for so long, we've learned to metabolize it. Every nightmare they send us gets converted into fuel for our defense systems. Every wave of terror becomes power for our weapons." Marcus stared at the displays, showing energy levels that exceeded anything in human technology. "How is this possible?" "Because we're human," Sarah said simply. "We've always been afraid of something. The dark, death, failure, loneliness, meaninglessness. But we've also always used that fear to make us stronger, smarter, more determined. They picked the wrong species to try to break with terror. The second phase of the war began when humanity launched their first terror-powered spacecraft. The Vindication was unlike anything ever built by human hands, its hull infused with crystallized fear energy, its weapons systems powered by concentrated nightmare fuel. Captain Rivera commanded the mission that would take the fight directly to the alien fleet. But they weren't going alone. Across the galaxy, something unprecedented was happening. The Vorthak Empire had ruled through fear for so long that they had never developed other forms of diplomacy or communication. As news of humanity's resistance spread through their vast territories, other conquered species began to whisper among themselves. If the humans could fight back, perhaps freedom was possible. Elder Mordegath received the reports in his private chambers aboard the Eternal Dominion. Revolts were breaking out on 17 different worlds. Species that had been subjugated for thousands of years were suddenly remembering what it felt like to feel something other than fear. Hope was spreading through the galaxy like a virus, and the Vorthak had no cure for hope. Elder, his aide's neural transmission carried undertones of panic that would have been impossible just months ago. "The humans have made contact with the Zephyrian rebels, the Crystalline Collective, and even the Void Wanderers. They're forming some kind of alliance." This was catastrophic. The Vorthak Empire's power was absolute only as long as their subjects remained isolated and afraid. But humanity had done something no species had ever accomplished. They had turned fear into communication, terror into diplomacy. They were teaching other races that the Vorthak could be resisted. The final battle took place in the space between Mars and Jupiter, where the two fleets met in a confrontation that would determine the fate of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. The Vorthak arrived with over 300 ships, each one capable of broadcasting enough psychic terror to paralyze an entire world. Humanity met them with 50 vessels powered by converted fear energy and accompanied by ships from 24 different species that had joined the rebellion. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became the greatest reversal in galactic history. Captain Rivera stood on the bridge of the Vindication as the two fleets closed distance. Around him, displays showed the massive alien ships beginning their psychological assault. Waves of terror washed over the human fleet, but instead of paralyzing the crews, the fear was immediately channeled into the ship's power systems. "All ships, this is Vindication," Marcus broadcast to the Allied fleet. "Remember, they can make us afraid, but they can't make us quit. Channel that fear into focus. Use their terror as fuel for determination. Show them what happens when they try to break a species that's been afraid of the dark for 1,000,000 years, and learn to light fires instead of hiding." The human ships began broadcasting their own psychological attacks, but these were different from the Vorthak's primal terror. Human psychological warfare was sophisticated, creative, and targeted. They broadcast the fear of artistic insignificance to a species that had never created anything beautiful. They transmitted the terror of intellectual stagnation to minds that had stopped growing millennia ago. Most devastatingly, they projected the horror of being forgotten by the universe to beings who had built their entire identity around eternal domination. Commander Zixathala watched her fleet begin to dissolve around her. Ships that had conquered thousands of worlds were now fleeing in panic from vessels constructed by a species that had only achieved spaceflight a few centuries ago. Her own crew was abandoning their posts, overwhelmed by fears they had never learned to process. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through on an open channel, transmitted simultaneously to every ship in both fleets. "We can stop this," she said, her words cutting through the psychic noise of the battle. "Fear doesn't have to be a weapon, it can be a teacher. You've spent 50,000 years making other species afraid, but you've never learned to understand your own fear. We can show you how." For the first time in the war, the human broadcasts weren't attacks. They were offers of understanding. Instead of trying to break the Vorthak with terror, humanity began transmitting lessons on how to transform fear into growth, anxiety into motivation, and terror into the courage to change. Elder Mordegath felt the transmission reach his mind, and for the first time in his 3,000-year existence, he understood what he had been running from all his life. The Vorthak had conquered the galaxy not because they were fearless, but because they were more afraid than any other species. They had weaponized terror because they were terrified of being vulnerable, of being seen as weak, of discovering that they were not the gods they pretended to be. The war ended not with surrender, but with understanding. The Vorthak fleet powered down their weapons, and humanity offered something no conquered species had ever received from them: a chance to learn how to live with fear instead of being ruled by it. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine. The Vorthak Empire transformed into the Galactic Counseling Collective, using their understanding of fear to help species overcome trauma and build stronger societies. Humanity became the mediators of the galaxy, teaching other races how to turn their fears into strengths. And somewhere in the deep space between the stars, children of a dozen different species would grow up hearing the story of the day when the most terrifying force in the galaxy learned that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to keep going despite being afraid. The humans had taught the universe something profound: fear was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the next chapter. Dr. Sarah Chen often stood on the observation deck of the orbital research station that now orbited Earth, watching ships from hundreds of different worlds come and go in peaceful commerce and cultural exchange. They came not as conquerors or subjects, but as equals, united by a shared understanding that fear, properly understood, was not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher to be respected. And in the deepest part of space, where the old Vorthak Empire had once broadcast terror to subjugate entire civilizations, new signals now traveled between the stars. Not threats or demands for submission, but invitations to learn, to grow, and to discover that the universe was far less frightening when you faced it together. The galaxy had learned to laugh in the face of fear, and it was humanity that had taught them how to smile.